During this presentation, we are going to discuss the fundamentals to understanding behavior. The goals of this training module are to first define what behavior is. Next, we will discuss some possible reasons for why an undesired behavior would occur, or in other words, determining the function of the behavior. We will then talk about different techniques we can use in order to manage undesired or challenging behaviors, with a focus on reinforcement procedures. The first question we want to ask ourselves is, what is behavior? Behavior is everything that a person does. Behavior includes all of our actions that have an effect on the environment. This includes our physical actions, for example, waving hello to someone when you see them, our words, for example, asking someone for help, and our thoughts, for example, thinking about what we are going to do over the weekend. A simple guideline that can be used to identify whether or not something qualifies as a behavior is the dead man's test. The dead man's test simply asks, can a dead man do it? If the answer is yes, then it does not pass the dead man's test and is not considered behavior. Let's take talking, for example. If we ask the question, can a dead man not talk? The answer would be yes. By the nature of being dead, we all know that you are unable to speak and therefore able to not talk. On the other hand, if you change the question so that it was worded as, can a dead man talk? The answer would be no. If the answer is no, then what we are talking about is behavior. From this example, we can see that what's important to keep in mind when thinking about behavior goals is framing these goals as measurable, operationalizable behaviors. As in the previous example, framing an action in terms of not doing something would not pass the dead man's test and would not be considered a behavior. When thinking about a behavior, we want to make sure that what we are talking about are those behaviors that we want to see happen and not what we don't want to see happen. Returning to the talking example, if we had a student who talked excessively during class and we wanted to target talking as a behavior goal, we would ask ourselves how much or how often is that person talking. Once we had a sense of where that behavior currently was, we could begin to set reduction goals. For example, if we determined that a child talked for 15 minutes during a 1-hour observation, we would initially want to set a goal that the child talked for 45 minutes during the observation. We would not want to write the goal as the child did not talk for 15 minutes. We always want to put the focus on what it is we want the individual to be doing and not what it is we don't want them to do. Challenging behaviors are those behaviors that may hinder a student's social or academic development. This does not mean that these are bad behaviors or non-functional behaviors, but rather that the behavior is interfering with another skill or area of development. In thinking about what constitutes a challenging behavior, we have to think about when and why that behavior is occurring, or in other words, what the function of that behavior is. Because some behaviors may seem harmless at first, we need to gather more information. Let's take singing, for example. While singing in the shower or during free time is not problematic, singing while someone is giving you instructions may hinder your ability to pay attention and limit your ability to complete the task presented. All behaviors, appropriate and inappropriate, are learned and serve some purpose. Behaviors do not just happen for no reason. They are created through interaction with the environment. When a behavior occurs, it is followed by some consequence. If that consequence is favorable, then we are likely to repeat the behavior again in the future. This is called reinforcement. Coming back to the singing example, if by singing when instructions are delivered you escape a demand, in other words the task is given to another person and you no longer have to do it, you will learn that if you sing when instructions are being delivered, you will get out of doing the task, and the next time someone is giving you an instruction, you will begin to sing. Now that we know that all behaviors are learned and created by interaction with the environment, we can think about how to address challenging behaviors. We have to keep in mind that behavior is happening now because it works. When the behavior happened in the past, it got us access to something that we wanted, and so this behavior continues to occur in order to get us access to that reinforcer. The behavior serves a purpose or has a function for the individual. Let's take crying, for example. Whenever Sally takes her daughter to the grocery store, her daughter asks for candy in the checkout line. When Sally says no, that her daughter cannot have candy, her daughter begins to cry and scream. Sally responds by buying her daughter candy, and she stops crying. Sally's daughter has learned that when her mom says no, if she cries, she will get the candy that she wants. Thinking about this crying behavior, we know that what triggers this behavior is being in the checkout line and mom saying no when her daughter asks for candy. The consequence of the behavior is that the child gets the candy that she wants. In order to get rid of a behavior, it has to stop working. Coming back to the crying example, this means that when the daughter starts to cry, she still does not get the candy that she wants. The behavior can no longer get you access to the reinforcer in order for the behavior to stop happening. Whenever a behavior no longer gets you what you want, you'll try a little harder at first to get that reinforcer, and the behavior will get worse before it gets better. Coming back again to the child who cries in order to get candy in the checkout line, When that behavior first stops working, she'll cry a little louder or for a longer period of time in order to try to get that candy she wants. Even though it seems like what you're doing is not working, you need to stick with it. And over time, once the individual learns that the challenging behavior no longer works, it will eventually go away. The most important part is sticking to what you say and not providing the reinforcer when the behavior occurs, and more importantly, not giving in when that behavior gets worse. When we think about the behavior-environment interaction, we need to consider both intended and unintended consequences of behavior. Sometimes when we respond to a person's behavior, our response has unintended effects on that other person's behavior. In other words, even though we think that we are doing the right thing at that moment when a behavior occurs, when we take a step back, we can see how our reaction to the other person's behavior helped to create a challenging behavior by accident. Let's take Stephen for example. Stephen strikes his head against the wall. His mom immediately goes to him and consoles him. Stephen's mom does this because she doesn't want Stephen to hurt himself and is trying to protect him. However, what Stephen has learned is that if he bangs his head against the wall, he will get his mom's attention, and the next time he wants attention from mom, he is likely to bang his head again. Stephen's mom had the right intentions, in that she wanted to protect her son from harm, but by responding to his head-banging behavior by consoling him, Stephen was able to get the attention that he wanted, and mom inadvertently reinforced his head-banging behavior. As another example, Sarah jumps up and down, flaps her hands, and screams loudly at church. In an attempt to quiet her, Dad gives her a piece of candy from his pocket. Dad's response has the effect that he wanted and gets Sarah to quiet down. However, what Sarah has learned is that screaming, flapping, and jumping will get her candy from Dad. In this example, Dad just wanted to get Sarah to be quiet in church, and he knew that if he gave her a piece of candy, he would accomplish this goal. What Dad didn't consider is the fact that he now has taught Sarah that jumping up and down, flapping her hands, and screaming will get her a piece of candy. These examples highlight the importance of thinking not only about the intended effect of the consequence, but also the unintended effects that a consequence will have on behavior. Every situation has three components. If we think about any behavior that occurs, we can analyze what are known as the ABCs of that behavior. The first thing we want to consider is the A, or the antecedent. What this means is that we need to think about what happened immediately before that behavior occurred. This may include any environmental stimuli or events, such as the activity that was taking place, who was around and what that person was saying or doing, and the temperature in the room, just to name a few examples. Next, we can focus on the B, or the behavior itself. This is the physical, verbal, or mental action that has an effect on the environment. We want to provide the best description of the behavior possible so that any person who is observing can easily identify the behavior. And lastly, we want to turn our attention to the C, or the consequence of that behavior. Here we are going to hone in on what happens immediately after the behavior occurs. We are trying to identify what purpose a behavior serves by looking at what happens right after the behavior is emitted. Let's focus our attention now on the consequences of behavior. The consequences of our behaviors determine how likely it is that we are going to engage in that behavior again. In other words, behavior is strengthened or weakened by its consequences. When we engage in a behavior and we like the outcome that follows that behavior, we are most likely going to exhibit it again to get access to that consequence. This is called a reinforcing effect. Reinforcers increase the likelihood that a behavior will happen again in the future. In contrast, if our behavior results in some stimuli that we do not like and that we do not want again, then we are unlikely to engage in that behavior. This is called a punishing effect. Punishers are the opposite of reinforcers. Punishers decrease the likelihood that a behavior will happen again in the future. Lastly, if the consequence that follows our behavior does not influence whether or not we engage in that behavior again, then we would say that that consequence has no effect on our behavior. The consequence is neither a reinforcer nor a punisher. What is important to keep in mind when we are thinking about consequences of behavior is the effect that that consequence has on the likelihood that we exhibit that behavior again. If we are likely to repeat it, then the consequence has a reinforcing effect. If we are not likely to repeat the behavior, then the consequence has a punishing effect. And if that particular consequence does not change whether or not we engage in that behavior again, then that consequence had no effect on our behavior. There are four consequences of behavior that we can talk about. A consequence of a behavior is defined by the function that the specific stimulus or event has on the behavior. If a behavior continues to occur, in other words, it is maintained at the same rate, or the behavior increases, then we say that the consequence is a reinforcer. If the behavior decreases or is eliminated, then we say that the consequence of the behavior is a punisher. Reinforcers always increase or maintain a behavior, and punishers always decrease a behavior. What is important to keep in mind is that these things will vary from one person to the next. What is a reinforcer for one person's behavior may not be a reinforcer for another person's behavior. The other component of consequences we need to think about is whether something was added to or taken away from the environment. When something is added to the environment, we call it positive. We can have both positive reinforcers, for example, providing praise, giving someone a piece of candy, or providing attention following a behavior. But we can also have positive punishers, for example, being reprimanded or spanked following an inappropriate behavior, or being given a speeding ticket. This can get confusing since in this case the word positive does not mean good, but instead means presenting something. On the other hand, when we take something away from the environment, this is called negative. Again, we can have both negative reinforcement and negative punishment, with the word negative simply meaning to take away. Some examples of negative reinforcement may be taking a break and removing a task or demand that was present, opening an umbrella on a rainy day so that you do not get wet, or pressing the snooze button on your alarm to get rid of the annoying buzzing sound. Again, we are removing something that increases the likelihood that we will do that behavior again. In the case of the alarm, pressing the button turns off the buzzing sound. So we are removing the aversive sound, and the next time our alarm goes off, we are going to press the button again to get rid of that awful noise. In contrast, negative punishment is going to be removing something positive in an effort to decrease a behavior. For example, if a child comes in after their curfew, their parents may take away their privileges for a month. In this case, we are removing privileges to decrease the behavior of staying out past curfew. The next time the child is out, they are more likely to come home on time so that their privileges are not taken away. To quickly recap, reinforcement increases a behavior and punishment decreases a behavior. Positive means we have added something to the environment, and negative means we have taken something away from the environment. Coming back to the idea that challenging behaviors are learned, there are 4 main reasons or functions for challenging behavior. The first reason why a challenging behavior may occur is to gain access to social attention from others. This attention may be positive, for example, a comforting statement, or negative, for example, a reprimand. Attention may also be either verbal or physical, for example, a comforting touch. And lastly, attention may simply involve getting someone to look at you. The next function a challenging behavior may serve is to get access to a preferred item. This can be an activity that you would like to engage in, a toy that you want, or an edible. The third function of challenging behaviors is escaping or avoiding an activity that you don't really want to do. A challenging behavior that happens once a task has occurred is referred to as escape. For example, when Sam is given a math worksheet to complete, he throws the paper and pencil on the floor. The teacher responds by giving him another activity to engage in. What Sam has learned is when I don't want to do math, I can just throw the paper on the floor and I get out of having to do my work. In other words, he has escaped the unpleasant task of completing his math worksheet. Avoidance, on the other hand, occurs when the behavior happens prior to the task even being presented, in an effort to not have to participate in that task at all. For example, if a child does not like to go outside on the playground, right before it is time to go outside, they may engage in self-injurious behavior, and therefore they are never taken outside onto the playground. The last function of challenging behavior is automatic reinforcement or stimulation. This means that the behavior does not rely on anything external to the person, but rather that the behavior itself is internally pleasing in some way. The function of these behaviors is only to give the person some of the internal sensation that is pleasing, or to remove an internal sensation that is displeasing. For example, a child may rock back and forth because it is enjoyable to them. They like the rocking sensation. Or as another example, a child may rub their knee to soothe the pain after accidentally banging it on the corner of a table. Whenever we are faced with a challenging behavior that we would like to reduce or eliminate, we need to figure out which of the 4 common functions that behavior is serving. To do this, we need to first clearly define the behavior. This definition needs to include what the behavior looks like and how often it is occurring. When defining a behavior, we want to be specific. For example, if we were to define hitting, we may say that this behavior involves striking another person with a closed fist or open hand with enough force that makes a noise, or results of the contact is visible. For example, leaving a bruise, being knocked over, or the person complaining of pain. Hitting does not include friendly greetings such as a pat on the back or a high five. The second step to defining the behavior is determining how often the behavior happens. The method that we use to get a sense of how often an individual is engaging in a behavior will depend on the behavior itself. For the behaviors that have a discrete start and stop, like the hitting behavior defined previously, we can use a frequency count of the number of times the behavior happens. For other behaviors that do not have a definitive start and stop that is meaningful, it may be better to determine how long the behavior occurs for. For example,
It would be more meaningful to know that a child cried for 1 hour than it is to say that a child cried one time without any indication of how long he cried for. The second step in determining the function of a challenging behavior is to figure out what the antecedents are. We need to figure out in what situation does the behavior occur and when does it not occur. We also want to know if the behavior is happening in specific places. In other words, are there some places where the behavior happens and other places where it never happens? For example, a child may hit other kids on the playground at school, but does not hit other kids during any indoor activities. The last step in determining the function is to figure out the why. We need to ask ourselves, what is the reason for this behavior, or what function does this behavior serve? To do this, we need to identify what happens immediately following the behavior we are interested in. Knowing the consequence of the behavior will help us identify why it continues to occur. Coming back to the previous example of the child who hits other children on the playground, after observing, we may note that when he hits another child, he is put in timeout. This involves bringing the child back inside and taking him off of the playground. From this, we can determine that the hitting is functioning as escape. Although the staff is trying to use a timeout procedure to reduce the hitting behavior, it is actually acting as a negative reinforcer that allows the child to escape the unpleasant activity of being outside. When we follow the 3 steps just discussed, again, these are first, defining the behavior, next, determining the antecedents, and finally, identifying the consequences, we are using a procedure called ABC recording. ABC recording allows us to piece all the information together in order to figure out the function or the reason for the challenging behavior. We will now go through a few examples to try and determine the function of these behaviors. In our first example, Mary is talking on the phone. This is the antecedent. While Mary is talking on the phone, Jose enters the room and starts to sing loudly. This is the target behavior. When Jose begins to sing, Mary stops her conversation and tells Jose to stop. This is what happens immediately following the behavior, or the consequence. What is the function? The function of this behavior is attention. When Mary is on the phone and engaged in a conversation, she is not paying attention to Jose. When Jose comes into the room and begins to sing loudly, Mary stops talking and turns her attention to Jose. Even though this behavior is not the most appropriate way to get Mary's attention, it would be more appropriate to say, "Excuse me." It accomplishes the goal, and Jose continues to sing loudly when Mary is on the phone. For our next example, we'll look at Alex's behavior. In the morning, when Alex wakes up, he likes to have milk. Alex's mom always brings Alex his milk, but she is usually in another room when he wakes up. Alex screams for his mom to get him milk. When Alex begins to scream, Mom will leave the room she is in and bring Alex his bottle of milk. What is maintaining Alex's screaming behavior? Alex has learned that screaming for milk will get his mom to stop what she is doing, even though she is in another room, and bring him his milk. The function of this behavior is tangible. He is receiving his bottle of milk. It would be more appropriate for Alex to either go get the milk himself or to walk over to the room that Mom is in and ask her for his milk. In our next example, Zori is sitting at her desk when the teacher comes over and gives her an assignment to complete. The assignment was not something that Zori liked to do, and she began hitting her head. Upon hitting her head, the teacher sent Zori to the reading area, and she stopped hitting her head. What is the function of Zori's head-hitting behavior? When Zori begins to hit her head, the undesirable task is taken away, and she is allowed to engage in a preferred activity. Head-hitting behavior functions as escape in this situation.
In our last example, children are sitting at their desks and the teacher tells them that they need to treat their friends nicely. While the teacher is talking, Susan starts to rock and play with her hair. The teacher does not pay attention to Susan's behavior and continues to talk to the class. As a result, Susan continues to rock and play with her hair. In this example, Susan begins to rock and play with her hair when the teacher is addressing the class. The teacher does not address the behavior, stop talking, or remove Susan from the situation. From this, we can conclude that the behavior served an automatic or sensory function. This behavior feels internally good to Susan, so she continues to do it. So far, we have talked about the reasons why a behavior continues to occur, or in other words, the reinforcement, and reasons why people engage in challenging behaviors, or in other words, how to determine the function of the behavior. Now, what can we do in order to get rid of these challenging behaviors? The first thing that we want to do is to stop providing the reinforcer that follows the behavior. When we did our ABC recording, we identified the consequences of the behavior that were serving as reinforcers, and now we need to make sure that these are taken away. In order to get rid of a challenging behavior, it needs to not work anymore. Once the behavior stops working for the person, they will stop doing it. However, we also want to teach the individual how to get access to the reinforcer in an appropriate way. This is called a replacement behavior. The replacement behavior is going to be a new behavior that the person can use that is more appropriate, but serves the same function as the behavior we want to get rid of. When we are thinking about replacement behaviors, we want to ask ourselves what a typical student or adult would do in the same situation. Replacement behaviors need to be socially appropriate. Remember that we are trying to replace this challenging behavior with something that is more acceptable. Our new behavior also has to provide the same results as the challenging behavior. If the challenging behavior functions for teacher attention, then the replacement behavior that we are teaching must also function to get the teacher's attention. The next thing we need to consider is that we want the new behavior to be as efficient as the challenging behavior. Thinking again about a challenging behavior that functions to get teacher attention, this behavior probably works very quickly. For example, as soon as Sally hits another child, the teacher immediately turns around and tells Sally to keep her hands to herself. If we want to teach Sally to raise her hand to get the teacher's attention, raising her hand has to work as well as hitting another child did. If Sally raises her hand for 5 minutes and the teacher still has not provided her with the attention that she is looking for, this is not going to be a suitable replacement behavior. And lastly, we want our replacement behavior to be as easy to do as the challenging behavior. If we make our replacement behavior too effortful, it is not going to be a practical alternative to the challenging behavior that requires little effort. Let's take Johnny's behavior for example. Johnny is a 16-year-old boy who communicates primarily by using 1 to 2 word utterances. The behavior that we are interested in replacing is screaming. This typically happens when the teacher is engaged with another student or in a task and not paying attention to Johnny. When Johnny screams, the teacher turns around and tells Johnny that he needs to use his inside voice or redirects him to the task that he is supposed to be engaging in. We have determined that the function of Johnny's behavior is to gain the teacher's attention. In order to reduce the screaming behavior, we want to teach Johnny a more appropriate way to gain the teacher's attention. We may want to teach Johnny to say "look" when he wants the teacher to pay attention to him. Once we have identified the function of the challenging behavior we want to reduce or eliminate, and come up with a more appropriate behavior to replace this behavior with, we then need to teach the new behavior that we want the child to use. In order to do this, there are several guidelines that we can follow. The first is that we want to teach the behavior in good times. This means that we don't want to wait until the behavior occurs and we are trying to manage that challenging behavior before we begin to teach our new replacement behavior. For example, if we know that a student engages in headbanging in order to get attention from the teacher, we want to teach the student to say "look at me" or "I need help" at times when the headbanging is not already occurring. Teaching during the good times will hopefully provide the child with a new strategy to get access to the reinforcer that they want and prevent the challenging behavior from ever occurring. While teaching, we want to practice the new behavior many, many times. It is going to take more than one time of using this new strategy to demonstrate its effectiveness. We want to capitalize on as many instances as we can to teach our new behavior. When we are teaching a new, more appropriate behavior, the individual has to learn that this behavior will work for them. This means that every time the individual engages in our new replacement behavior, we have to be ready to provide the reinforcer. If we don't do this, the individual may not make the connection that this new replacement behavior can be used to get them access to what they want, and they will go back to using the strategy they know works, or that challenging behavior. This is part of demonstrating the behavior reinforcer contingency. We need to link the behavior to its reinforcer by providing the reinforcer immediately following the behavior every time it occurs. And lastly, we want to keep practicing this new behavior until it is mastered. Mastery means that the individual is performing the new replacement behavior and not the challenging behavior in order to get access to that reinforcer. Once we have reached mastery, our work is not done. We still need to prompt the replacement behavior when we see those antecedent signals. This means that we want to remind the student they need to perform the replacement behavior to get access to the reinforcer they are looking for. The why, or the function of the behavior, is helpful in not only finding replacement behavior, but also in determining what other strategies we can use to help manage problem behaviors. There are proactive strategies that we can use to prevent problem behaviors from occurring. Proactive methods happen before the problem behavior has occurred and allow us to manipulate the environment, including our own behavior, to reduce the likelihood that a challenging behavior ever happens. There are going to be times, however, that a behavior does occur and we have to use reactive methods. When using reactive methods, we want to make sure that we are reacting in a way that will lead to reduction of the problem behavior and not accidentally reinforce the behavior. One proactive procedure that we can use to make it less likely for a challenging behavior to take place is to create a structured and enriched environment.
We know that problem behaviors occur when individuals are unengaged in activity or when they are unable to predict what is going to happen next. In order to structure our time effectively and to make the environment as productive as possible, we need to plan ahead and have activities and tasks ready to go. The more prepared we are, the more smoothly we can transition both within an activity and from one activity to the next. When we are prepared, we are leaving less room for error, and it is less likely that a child will engage in challenging behaviors because they are busy with other activities. Another proactive strategy is to have a routine and to follow it. We all like to know what we have to do and when we have to do it. When an individual does not know where they are supposed to be or what they are supposed to be doing, and they have no way of predicting what is coming next or how long it is until they are able to take part in a preferred activity, we are opening the door for problem behaviors to occur. If for some reason your schedule has to change, for example, there is a class field trip and the whole day is different, or it is raining and you are unable to go to the playground, we want to make sure to prepare our students for these changes so they are not a surprise. Preparing students properly will reduce the anxiety associated with these unexpected events and help the day to proceed smoothly with few challenging behaviors. In all of our planning and preparing, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that the activities that we are doing, while structured and educational, also need to be fun and inviting. If you are having fun with what you are doing and you want to participate, even in those subjects or tasks you don't really prefer, then you are less likely to engage in problem behaviors. And lastly, you want to make sure to use your resources at hand. Everyone is going to have tried different techniques and strategies and to have had different successes and losses. Sharing these experiences with each other will help everyone figure out how best to deal with a variety of situations in a fun, creative, and effective way. As mentioned in the previous slides, daily schedules are one proactive method that can help to reduce the number of challenging behaviors displayed. Daily schedules allow each student to be able to identify not only what activity they should be engaged in, but also allow them to predict what is coming next. This will help reduce anxiety of the unexpected. Individual schedules also allow the child to keep track of how long it will be until a preferred activity takes place. For example, if a student really likes lunchtime, they can quickly see how many activities are left before lunch. In addition to each child having their own daily schedule with the activities broken down for them, it is also often helpful to have a general schedule posted for the whole class. This can help keep everyone oriented, even if there are times when each individual is not doing the exact same thing. Visual task analyses are another way to create predictability in an activity. Using a visual, this can be either pictures or words, to indicate what needs to be done in order to complete the activity, as well as what you can do when you are done, gives the individual the ability to complete the task at hand with little support from another person and fosters independence. The predictability of a visual task analysis limits the amount of time that the child spends unengaged, not knowing what they have to do, and will in turn limit the number of challenging behaviors emitted. When we are trying to teach an alternative behavior, we still need a way to deal with the challenging behavior when it does occur. One way to do this is to actively ignore the behavior. This strategy will work only if the function of the behavior is to get your attention. In other words, only those behaviors that are maintained by attention will be reduced or eliminated by actively ignoring the behavior. Active ignoring does not mean that we are letting the child get away with the challenging or inappropriate behavior. Rather, we are trying to reduce the behavior by not providing the child with the attention they are looking for. Sometimes eye gaze alone is enough to reinforce a behavior, so when we have decided that we are going to actively ignore a behavior, we have to limit any and all forms of attention when that challenging behavior is occurring. For self-injurious or other harmful behaviors, we want to make sure to block the behavior while providing minimal attention. This means that we do not want to talk or provide eye contact while we are blocking the behavior. If the behavior that we are targeting functions as escape, meaning that the child is trying to get out of an activity, then we want to prevent this from happening. This means that when the child engages in the challenging behavior, we do not allow them to get out of the activity. We want to teach the child that the challenging behavior will not get them out of completing the task or activity. We would also want to teach them an appropriate way to ask for a break. No matter what the function of the challenging behavior, we want to make sure that there are always reinforcing appropriate behaviors. Appropriate behaviors may take the form of the replacement behavior that we are trying to teach, but may also be some behavior that the child spontaneously engages in. We want to make sure that these appropriate behaviors continue to happen, and the way we do this is by reinforcing them when they do occur. In order to ensure that we are in fact promoting the appropriate behaviors that we would like an individual to engage in, there are several guidelines that we need to keep in mind with regard to delivering the reinforcer. We want to make sure that we deliver the reinforcer immediately after the behavior occurs. The less time that passes between the time the behavior happens and the time the reinforcer is presented, the better. This allows the individual to make the connection between what they are doing, their behavior, and the effect that their behavior has on the environment. In this case, they get something that they want. We also want to make sure that we are reinforcing appropriate behaviors that happen instead of problem behaviors. We want to stack the deck in our favor and make sure we are catching people being good and reinforcing their good behavior, rather than waiting for an inappropriate or challenged behavior to occur. Once an individual learns that reinforcement is available for all these appropriate behaviors, it is less likely that a problem behavior will occur. In order to do this, we need to reinforce those appropriate behaviors that we want to increase as often as possible. We call this a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Every time an individual engages in an appropriate behavior, we are going to make sure that that behavior results in access to the reinforcer that they are looking for. Motivational systems are a way to help the individual understand what they have to do in order to get access to a reinforcer. Motivational systems can be used as a way to access a tangible, edible, or other reinforcer. They may also be used as a way to indicate what the child needs to do before they can have a break. The target behaviors addressed using a token board motivational system can be a variety of activities or tasks, for example, completing academic tasks, like completing a certain number of math problems, or social tasks, like saying hello to someone who enters the room or answering a question when asked by a friend, or things like sitting quietly at a desk while waiting for the next activity to begin. What the target behaviors will be will depend on the individual child, and not all motivational systems will look the same. First then boards are another form of motivational system that provides a way for the individual to know the sequence of events. For example, first do your worksheet and then you can read a magazine. A first then board is a simple visual means of displaying what happens first before the individual gets to engage in a desired activity. In sum, we know that all behaviors are learned. Whether a behavior is appropriate or not, that behavior continues because the individual has learned that this behavior works for them. All of our behaviors continue because they get us access to something that we want. In order to get students to engage in appropriate behaviors, we want to set up the environment in a way that promotes independence and predictability. Reducing the amount of downtime will also reduce the number of challenging behaviors that are exhibited. When people know where they should be and what they need to do in order to get access to the things they want, we are creating an environment that facilitates access to reinforcers by engaging in appropriate rather than inappropriate or challenging behaviors. When we are faced with a challenging behavior, we need to first determine the function of that behavior in order to be able to get rid of it. Once we know why a person is engaging in an inappropriate behavior, we are then in a position to teach a more appropriate way for them to get access to what they want. Initially, when we are teaching these new, more appropriate behaviors, we want to make sure that we reinforce the appropriate behavior each and every time it occurs, so that the learner could then make the link between their behavior and the consequence. The less time that passes between the time the individual engages in the desired behavior and the time that the reinforcer is provided, the more likely it is that the individual will make the connection between their behavior and access to that desired object or event.